day is long and I feel alone. I put my trust in Jesus, for He's my home. When I'm feeling small or when I'm afraid, I put my trust in Jesus.
In the bustling city of High Ridge, where the rich flourished and the skyline was dominated by towering skyscrapers, Richard Dorman reigned as one of the most powerful real estate moguls. His empire was built on cunning and ruthlessness, founded on hostile takeovers and schemes that preyed on small businesses and the poor. However, behind every major deal stood his wife, Caroline Dorman, the cold-hearted mastermind who pushed Richard to exploit every opportunity. One day, Richard set his sights on a small vineyard on the outskirts of the city, owned by John Abel, a simple man who had inherited the land from his ancestors. For John, the vineyard was more than just property. It was the legacy of his family. Every day, John walked through the vineyard, caring for it with love and devotion, seeing it as a connection to the life he had built with his late wife. Richard and Caroline visited John's vineyard, envisioning it as a grand luxury resort for High Ridge's elite. As they walked among the rows of grapevines, Richard made his offer. "John, this vineyard is beautiful, but it could be so much more. I'm offering you a large sum, far beyond what the land is worth. Think of what you could do with the money." But John stood firm. "Mr. Dorman, this vineyard is more than just land to me. It's my family's legacy, and I cannot sell it for any amount of money." Richard's face darkened with frustration, but Caroline remained unshaken. "He's naive," she said to Richard as they left the vineyard. "We'll get the land one way or another." Caroline wasted no time in orchestrating a plan. They spread malicious rumors, accusing John of illegal activities on his vineyard. The authorities, influenced by Richard and Caroline's wealth and power, launched an investigation. John, overwhelmed by the stress and humiliation, fell into despair. Not long after, he passed away, heartbroken. With John out of the way, Richard and Caroline quickly acquired the vineyard. But before they could turn it into a luxury resort, tragedy struck. Caroline, ambitious and unsatisfied, went after another local business. This time, the business owner, pushed to the brink by the Dormans' relentless pursuit, confronted Caroline. In a moment of desperation, he shot and killed her. Caroline's death left Richard devastated. His empire began to crumble without her guiding hand. His two sons, Carl and Marv, who had been living reckless lives of addiction and indulgence, were of no help. Instead of stepping up, they fell deeper into drugs and mismanaged the remnants of Richard's wealth. The money they squandered fueled their habits, and they quickly sold off what was left of Richard's fortune to fund their addictions. As Richard's life spiraled out of control, he suffered a debilitating stroke. Partially paralyzed, he was left dependent on the care of others, abandoned by his sons. Carl and Marv, consumed by their own addictions, cut ties with their father, leaving him alone to fend for himself. Richard, once a titan of industry, now relied on charity from the church and state for his welfare. While Richard languished in his hospital bed, haunted by his past, he was visited by visions of John Abel. He saw John standing in the vineyard, his eyes filled with sorrow, but not anger. In these visions, Richard saw himself as a king who had wronged an innocent man, like the biblical Ahab who had stolen Naboth's vineyard. The weight of his guilt bore down on him, and though he prayed for forgiveness, he knew that his sins could never be fully undone. As Richard's condition deteriorated, a new doctor was assigned to his case, David Abel, John's son. After his father's death, David had fallen into a deep depression. The malicious lies spread about his father, combined with the grief of losing him, had driven David to a mental breakdown. For a time, David disappeared from the world, consumed by anger and sorrow. But in his darkest moment, Jesus reached out to him, offering comfort and healing. Through his faith, David found the strength to move forward, dedicating his life to both medicine and ministry. When David saw Richard's name on his patient list, the shock was overwhelming. The man responsible for his father's death now lay helpless before him. In that moment, David thought of King David and Saul, how David had the chance to kill Saul when he was vulnerable, but chose to spare him. Now, David had Richard's life in his hands. And the temptation to let him suffer, or even worsen his condition, was strong. Each time David entered the room, he wrestled with the urge to make Richard pay for what he had done. But one night, David had a powerful encounter with Jesus, reminding him that vengeance belonged to God, not man. The message was clear: vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. David knew that it was not his place to seek revenge, no matter how much Richard deserved it. With renewed clarity, David chose the path of mercy. He treated Richard with the utmost care, ensuring that he received the medical attention he needed. Slowly, Richard's physical condition stabilized, but the effects of the stroke remained, leaving him permanently weakened. Though he recovered enough to leave the hospital, he would live with the consequences of the stroke for the rest of his life. Richard, now alone and abandoned by his sons, was left to reflect on the devastation his actions had caused. He had once dreamed of using what was left of his wealth for restitution, but with Carl and Marv having squandered everything, there was nothing left. All he could do was pray for forgiveness, for healing, and for peace for those he had hurt through his ruthless business practices. The vineyard, once nearly lost, was returned to David. Richard, knowing he had no right to keep it, ensured the land was restored to the Abel family. Under David's care, the vineyard flourished once more, a testament to his father's legacy and the resilience of the Abel family. In his final years, Richard spent his days in quiet contemplation, relying on the kindness of the church and social services for his survival. Though he had lost everything, he continued to pray daily, asking for God's forgiveness and seeking healing for those whose lives he had damaged. He knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he hoped that his prayers might bring some measure of peace to those he had wronged. David, having chosen the path of forgiveness, continued his dual role as a doctor and a youth pastor, guiding others through their struggles and teaching them about the power of faith, forgiveness, and redemption. The vineyard, now thriving under his care, stood as a reminder of the endurance of justice and the possibility of healing, even in the face of deep pain and loss. In the end, Richard Dorman died with little left of the empire he had built. But he had learned, too late, the value of humility, prayer, and the importance of seeking forgiveness. His legacy, once built on wealth and power, was now marked by the vineyard he had returned to its rightful owner. A small gesture of atonement for a life of greed and destruction.
I put my trust in Jesus.